Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today we're going to talk about the latest issue of the award-winning Wilson Quarterly magazine, online magazine, and our guests are editor Stephanie Bowen and one of the contributors, Robert Daly, who you might know as the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States for the current WQ. He's written a piece called U.S. China Engagement, Regrettable or Inevitable. The theme of the issue, the title of the issue, is Reconcilable Differences, Portraits of Challenging U.S. Partnerships. Welcome to both of you. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So, Stephanie, give us an overview of the issue. Tell us what we're going to be reading.
Yeah, well, the issue, as you said, is titled Reconcilable Differences, and it really is snapshots of different bilateral relationships between the U.S. and countries that are often very difficult to work with, where we might be at odds on some ideals, but have interests that we need to pursue. And it really takes a look at some of those push-pulls between those relationships and offers policymakers some insights on how to navigate them.
So the opening essay by Mark Green, the director, Ambassador Mark Green, director of the Wilson Center, president and director, he quotes Henry Kissinger, a man familiar to you, of course, Mr. Daly. And that quote is, "America has no permanent friends or enemies, only interests." Green, in his response, says he thinks that's a little too non-idealistic. Stephanie, tell us about the essays in general. Do they reflect this very pragmatic approach, or do they tend to look at things in a more idealistic manner?
I think they're a little bit of both. We have a wide array of contributions. As you mentioned, the introduction that we have from Ambassador Green really draws on some of both his upbringing and some of the principles that he was raised with, and then some experiences that he had working in countries like Egypt. And really, talking about how his views on working in some of these difficult countries have evolved over the years, and some ways that he has changed his thinking on not necessarily things being black and white, but a shade of gray. We have, I think, every essay deals with some of those really tricky elements of a relationship. We cover countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Mexico. I think it's just really, each one is its own unique story. Pakistan, I think I mentioned, and we've got wonderful examples too from former ambassadors who really come forward with some key insights that I think will help policymakers figure out how to navigate some of the, like I said, some of the trickier relationships that we have.
And Robert, you, of course, focus on a country that perhaps represents the greatest challenge as far as navigating the relationship. I was thinking as I was preparing to speak to you about Jimmy Webb's Wichita lineman line, and I need you more than want you. Talk about U.S. China relations in that regard.
You don't want to talk about Wichita linemen, huh? Well, this is the problems that Stephanie is discussing, the conflicts that we find between our ideals, our highest ideals, and our pragmatic needs. These are problems that all countries have, but the United States has them more prominently than others because, in addition to our interests, we also have a culture and a character which is uniquely morally self-righteous and evangelical, as Reinhold Niebuhr and others have pointed out. Our rhetoric tends toward, Sunday revival meeting. We are to be perfect. Other countries are to be perfect in our mode. And that's what gets us in trouble, is this insistence on perfection, our own and that of others, and our in an imperfect world. And this is especially true in China, where our rhetoric right now is as adversarial as it has been since the early 1970s. We have prominent politicians, not this administration, calling China an existential threat, an evil empire. China is framed as so irredeemably awful that it seems could be no way that we could work with China. But we do work with China all day, every day. Our trade volumes have gone up since the trade war. We are deeply involved with each other despite our rhetoric. And so China is sort of exhibit number one for this issue that Mark Green has been talking about. There are two different views of that now politically. There are those who think that we need to tone down the rhetoric to get it in alignment with the actually high degree of integration we have with China. And then there are those who think that we have to decouple from China, not be integrated in order to bring it in line with our rhetoric. The former, the ones who want to change the rhetoric, tend to be the foreign policy expert community. We find on Capitol Hill, in the intelligence community, the military, as well as really in both parties, but more from the right, the idea we need to decouple to bring our relations with China in keeping with our rhetoric. But no one seems to want to pay the cost of doing that. And there we're stuck.
So, Stephanie, you may not know this, but I've been interviewing Robert about China for, about a decade now, Robert? And the arc of our discussions, I would always be prone, as a journalist often is, to a little bit of hyperbole when, are we in a new Cold War, those types of questions. And Robert, ever the even-handed, level-headed analyst, would say, well, not necessarily, but over time, you've become more convinced that things are in a deteriorating state. Can you kind of mark a historical turning point in recent history where things began in this downward arc?
This is a favorite parlor game in Washington. Different people have different dates. Some will put it around 2010. Some go back to the Beijing Olympics of 2008, not the recent Olympics, the 2008 Olympics. I think the event that really changed minds most was 2016, when China completed its build out of man-made islands in the South China Sea, claimed that they gave China the right to territorial seas, had all of those claims rejected by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, but ignored the findings of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and didn't pay a price for it. No price was imposed. I think it was that more than any other one event that changed minds here. And then, of course, after that, we get the trade war, COVID, which tends to seal some of these more negative views in amber. But I think 2016 is the key year.
Stephanie, I want to ask you about, and Robert, I'm sure you are part and parcel to this, but the structure of Robert's piece, this doorway couplets, this Chinese tradition. How did that come about? It's really creative. It really was effective. And how did that emerge? Give us the behind the scenes as you and Robert talked about this essay.
It really was all Robert. It was his idea, and I think it was executed brilliantly by our partners at Marquee. We weren't exactly sure how it was going to come together, but I loved working on this just because I got to learn all about the history and the culture of the Chinese door couplets, but then to see it come to life through this example of a tough foreign policy questions, I think was really brilliant. So I'll let Robert take
I tell you, as a reader, I loved it as well. Robert, this is the bonus material. See, if you read the magazine and watch the episode, and you get all this bonus material.
Well, the idea to use the doorway couplets as a metaphor was my idea, but it was actually suggested. It goes back to the Wilson Center's Christmas party, actually, where Ambassador Mark Green spoke about his idea for this issue very much in terms of binaries. We say this, we do this. We do, both A and the opposite of A regularly in our policy toward China. And so I was thinking about a way to make that sort of binary approach to policy coherent. And because at the Wilson Center, most of us are deeply interested in the cultures as well as the histories of the countries that we study. And I've always been interested in the written Chinese language, the way that poetry is used, the way that the characters are used. And one of the most famous ways, for a lot of our readers who don't know China, this may seem sort of uniquely creative. But for the sinologists who study China all the time, they'll say, well, yes, of course, this lends itself to doorway couplets. So from their point of view, it wouldn't be so unique. It was really the Stephanie and her designers who took this graphically and understood the idea and made it work. But it goes back to this idea of binary opposites, which don't obliterate each other, which exist together. That was the source of the idea.
I have a question for you. It's clear that China was one early example that we knew we wanted to approach the relationship with China in this issue and really look at it. When you look at the issue as a whole, can you talk about, I guess, what are some of your big takeaways and what you think that policymakers can learn by looking at these relationships through this lens?
Well, the issue that comes up in all of these articles, all these case studies, is an old issue and a known problem for foreign affairs practitioners. And it's, again, the United States, like most countries, has ideals and has an ideal state of affairs. And we tend to think about the United States, its success, its progress in terms of a national virtue narrative. And we certainly preach all over the world the virtues of democracy, transparency, the usual list. But we have a hard time in a complex world actually acting in accordance with those wishes. And this is one of the reasons that Emerson said that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of the small-minded. You simply are not going to be above accusations of hypocrisy. It is, as I mentioned, especially a problem in the United States because we speak in our politics, both in our international affairs and our domestic politics, in such heavily moralistic and impractical terms. And we have never found a way to really reconcile ourselves to that. In fact, I think it has become worse as what are called the culture wars come more clearly into focus. When Reinhold Niebuhr was writing The Irony of American History, which points to these problems, the evangelical strain in American politics and its at times extreme unreality, there was more of a common culture in the United States then than there is now. And so this issue is really about the international expression of a problem that we all hear about on the nightly news domestically. And I don't think there's an answer, frankly, not to go too broadly philosophical on you. I think it's part of the human condition. We're stuck with needing things regardless of what we believe, and we've got to get them. And so we need to compromise. When do you do that? When can you compromise? When can you hold firm? That's the really difficult question, and it tends to be driven by each situation in each case, which is why we have this issue.
Using the doorway couplets organizing principle, you cover a number of issues: trade and technology, the pandemic, climate change. All of these are technical on one level. And then one that you then hit on is norms and ideology, what you were just talking about, which seems to be the stickiest of wickets, right? Because once you can solve that, maybe you could find common ground on the technical issues. How do you do that? You know both of these cultures very well. Are there points of connection? Are there similarities? Is there common ground that we can work with?
There's absolutely common ground at the level of what is sometimes called people to people, when you move away from the government. Chinese and Americans, generally speaking, get along fine. We have wholly comparable ideas about what constitutes fairness and justice, a good joke, whatever it may be. That's not the issue. It is at the political level where, at this point, we really do have, I think, incommensurate ideologies, in part because China really has changed over the past 10 years or so under Xi Jinping. This is the biggest factor that leads us to where we are today. America has made plenty of errors along the way. This is not to lay all the blame at China's door. But from the 1970s until about 2013, China was reforming. It was becoming more integrated, more liberal. Personal freedoms were expanding too slowly from our point of view. The Communist Party was also firmly and at times brutally in command right along. But the trajectories made sense such that we were comfortable with compromise and comfortable with cooperation with China. But now China's gone in the opposite direction, where there really is far more repression at home and aggression internationally. And so we're finding it very difficult now to cooperate. President Biden is framing this in terms of a global ideological struggle between the forces of authoritarianism, autocracy, and democracy. I think that's a little bit too simplistic. China and the United States are both uniquely wealthy, powerful, and self-regarding, deeply believe in their own exceptionalisms. And this is something that we, the United States, have not met before: power and our self-regard. but we really do have incommensurate governance at this phase. And so the question is whether we can keep from drifting into conflict to give these two countries time to change. But the conflicts are really quite real. They can't be wished away through mutual understanding or that kind of bromide anymore.
About that, a terrific passage. You write, preaching has never worked with China anyway. The People's Republic of China is too big to ignore, and the Chinese Communist Party is too self-certain to persuade. America cannot isolate China without isolating itself, nor can it impose costs on China that are not felt by Americans. We've faced nothing like it in our history. How to proceed? You raise the question, and then you don't leave it there. You do provide some answers. Could you summarize for us some of the recommendations you make?
Well, I think that the first thing we need to do, and I started by talking about rhetoric and reality. It shouldn't be too hard to shift our rhetoric, to get away from the overtly hostile. It simply doesn't help. We could cool temperatures without changing any of our goals and any of our values merely by changing our rhetoric. And I think very importantly, because as we've discussed separately, John, I do think this is essentially a kind of a Cold War going forward. We have to see if we can maximize our engagement going forward to take advantage of these many commonalities I just described, not between the Chinese and American people alone, but also between our institutions. Can we keep them involved and integrated to the greatest extent possible, even while we are carrying out a really very high stakes competition in which there is increasing danger of a catastrophic collapse in relations? I do think that given the large number of Chinese Americans, for example, who understand both countries, of Americans who've been to China, of institutions and communities and universities and corporations that have a history of collaborating with each other, how can we maximize their insights and their goodwill, which is still fairly deep, while our governments become ever more hostile? I think that is the necessary but not sufficient condition going forward.
Stephanie, I'm always interested in what the editor learns when they take on such a broad-ranging topic and look at it through these various case studies. The opening essay we talked about from Ambassador Green, where he talks about his childhood of the good guys versus bad guys paradigm and how that has been informed over time and become more nuanced. What was it for you? What was it like for you hearing people like Robert Daly dissect the U.S. China relationship, Kugelman on Pakistan? What did you learn?
I think, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But what was interesting, though, is I do feel that throughout this issue, as I was talking with authors and we were exploring different countries and relationships to explore, that refrain kept coming back, but we kept coming back to, we're at a different inflection point right now in America where the world is more complex, our needs are greater, and we need more partners than we ever have before in order to meet our interests. So we better learn how to work with all kinds of people. And I think, even now, just listening to, Robert talk, the whole idea of rhetoric and how that plays into this issue it's so important because, every day diplomats, and partners on the ground are working, hand in hand to make these things work while rhetoric is being ratcheted up around them, so I think, on all number of levels, I think it's just one of the pieces that I think about is from the Congo in particular, where there are so many people working to try and, help advance democracy in that country while, they're fighting corruption and, all of these other things that are needed, and competition for critical minerals. And it's just so complex. And there's so many things that are happening that I think that rhetoric part could comes into play in every single country, and just really helping keep things, on an even keel, I think is probably one of the best pieces of advice and insights to come out of this issue.
Yeah, maybe avoiding some of that self-righteous rhetoric that Robert flagged earlier, which leads me to a final question for you, Robert, drawing from your final word in the piece, where you turn the phrase hypocrisy neither fatal nor rare. Certainly words that echo in this town, perhaps echo in households around the world, let's be honest. What did you mean by that? I mean, it's fairly obvious in the context, but are you suggesting that we shouldn't fear a little hypocrisy when it comes to these types of relationships?
We cannot avoid it. We're going to be engaged in that. It's the nature of our domestic and our international politics. And so obviously it would be better to be consistent. I mentioned the article by George Kennan, one of his later articles in Foreign Affairs, which was about morality in foreign policy, in which he says, if there is such a thing as morality in foreign policy, then one of its hallmarks must be consistency. We have never met that standard. We never will meet that standard. That's simply not the world we live in. It's a question of our tolerance day to day, month to month, and the rest of the world's tolerance for inconsistency. The rest of the world will probably be more tolerant of American inconsistency if we are a little bit more forgiving about the real and supposed sins of other nations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robert. Stephanie, some final thoughts from you about how people can read the issue, how they can subscribe, and then also, if you're prepared to, if you want to give us a preview of what's coming up in the next issue.
The publication is available free online at wilsonquarterly.com. You can sign up to subscribe, and we just send really infrequent emails. You get the issue when it comes out, and then a couple other updates when we have related items. I'm very excited about our next issue. I think it's going to be quite important. We're looking at some of the ripple effects, the bigger ripple effects of the Russia-Ukraine war. We've already got a number of really terrific pieces coming together for that, and look for publication in July.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for another tremendous issue. And, not necessarily the best thing about this, but one of the great things about this is we're not selling anything. This is available to you absolutely free. Just log in and read, and you'll find it a really rewarding experience because of the work of people like Robert Daly. Thanks, Stephanie, for today. Robert, as always, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.